Okay, we are going to begin with the second panel, so please take your seats.
How are they so calm? I get nervous doing this stuff. The kids are like, amazed. But it doesn't seem like everyone seems so calm. I'm doing nothing but just reading names. And I will, probably. I'll mumble through the names. Am I supposed to do something with it?
We're a little behind on time.
Okay. 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 Hi, I'm Mitch Cohn from Buckley.
Nice to meet you. I'm Zoe.
Nice to meet you guys. Thank you for doing this. This is an awesome festival. Yeah. We'll see. Am I reading your essay? Should I call them up? Are they going to come up here? Okay. Hi, everybody. We are about to start the second panel, Hierarchy and Patriarchy. So if the speakers could come up and take their seats so I don't have to riff. I'm not nearly as interesting as these guys. Cool. Thank you. Just as a little word of introduction, the writers in this panel cover an amazingly large swath of time and place, from ancient Greece to 2013 Detroit. And their analysis is also impressively all-encompassing, examining such topics as women's political power, or lack of it, the imbalance in heteronormative marriage, the importance of being aware of microaggressions, or as you'll hear in Britt Jacobson's piece, trust the eye, not the mouth. So I think, though, right now we're going to trust the minds and the mouths and start with Ms. Jacobson's essay, The Complexities of the Mouth, Eye, and Brow.
How do I do this? Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Britt Jacobson, and I will be discussing the prevalence of microexpressions in Jane Eyre. Microexpressions are facial movements typically lasting no more than 1.5 seconds. They mirror emotions that someone may be attempting to conceal. Microexpressions were proven to be universal by American psychologist Paul Ekman. The 7 universal emotions he has found are anger, fear, sadness, disgust, surprise, contempt, and happiness. An important skill in learning body language is training the eye to detect the minute activity in the eyes, on the brow, and around the mouth. I have selected 3 emotions that I believe to be the most prevalent in Jane Eyre: contempt, sadness, and anger, known more appropriately for this novel as ire. According to the research of Ekman, the ability to recognize others' emotions in the form of microexpressions increases your connections with other people. Jane, the namesake of Jane Eyre, is endowed with facial literacy, but learns through connections with her superiors that fluid emotions and blunt interpretation of other people will not be accepted. Thus, she learns to repress her analytic nature, flourishing as a bystander. In this photo, we see a bodily indicator of repression. This gesture is known as the mouth guard, wherein someone subconsciously covers the region of the face through which they communicate. As such, this often indicates that they are withholding their true feelings. While considering the brutish tubbiness of her cousin, John Reed, Jane wonders if he read that notion in her face. It is confirmed that he did, as he strikes her for the look she had in her eyes 2 minutes since. Jane's expressive face not only manages to provoke Reed the son, but his mother as well, when her look must have struck Mrs. Reed as offensive, for she spoke with extreme, though suppressed, irritation. Jane attempts to avoid detection of Mr. Brocklehurst, equating personal safety from him with eluding observation. For all her efforts, she still becomes the focal point of the room. Jane describes the traumatic experience of having their eyes directed like burning glasses against her scorched skin. She begins to learn the art of containment, saying, "A child cannot give its furious feelings uncontrolled play." If you guys haven't read the book Jane Eyre, this is a scene where the schoolmaster places Jane on a chair for everybody to look at. So she effectively becomes ostracized from her community, and it creates a rift in her persona that I will talk about soon. Jane looks to her new idol, Miss Temple, whose face, when addressed by Brocklehurst, is pale as marble, assuming the coldness of the material, and her brow settled into petrified severity. The stony demeanor limits facial leakage and obscures the universal language of emotion from being expressed. Later in the novel, Rochester describes Jane's little pale face as having such a resolute, frozen look. Ekman researched UC Berkeley students and found cultural differences between Japanese students and American students in the way they express their emotions in public. While he was able to definitively determine that in private the expressions were universal, he noted that in the presence of an authority figure, the Japanese students masked negative emotions with positive expressions. Jane, like the Japanese students, assumed the cultural norm of public concealment. A burgeoning private persona is established within Jane and only presents itself in solitude or the presence of lower-class servants. So in the novel, that would be Bertha or other household servants. Jane observes in Rochester a complete indifference to his own external appearance. As a wealthy man, Rochester does not need to be reserved. He even encourages Jane to be as candid with him as possible. He draws attention to Jane's defiant brow, telling her to beware what she expresses with that organ, for he is quick at interpreting its language. Her insecurities in their relationship arise from her awareness that he, too, can read the eyes, brow, and mouth. When Rochester initially asks for Jane's hand in marriage, she asks him to let her look at his face, as she wants to read his countenance. In Ekman's research, there's a discrepancy between what is heard and what is seen. Jane trusts the eye, not the mouth. It is not mere tragedy that Janet and Rochester are finally wed only after he loses his sight. His blind dependency affords her the dominance in a household which she has always craved. Jane loves and accepts his disability, feeling secure in the knowledge that he can no longer gain a window into her psyche. Her private persona is able to flourish. As Jane herself admits, the soul has an interpreter in the eye. Thank you.
Next, happy to introduce a trio from Milken: Talia Pat, Jordan Ainsty, and Alexei Rybakov.
Hi, I'm Alexis Rybakov,
I'm Talia Pat.
And I'm Jordan Anstey.
and we're from Milken, and we wrote an essay comparing the fate of women between Shakespeare's Othello and the horror movie It Follows. So first, as an English class, we first read the novel Othello, which is a story, if you don't know, about race, love, jealousy, betrayal, secrets, and mystery. And, of course, death, because it's Shakespearean. And then we watched the movie It Follows, which is similarly about love, sex, mystery, desire, ghosts, and even a little death. We then created what's called a Frankenstein essay. I'm not sure if you guys know what this is, but it is, what we first did was we wrote an introduction as a class, as a collective, And then we wrote certain paragraphs about the movie in pairs. And then we each constructed our own paragraphs about either Desdemona or Emilia, which are two characters in Othello. And then we got to choose the opposite person's essay, like opposite paragraph. So if I wrote a paragraph on Emilia, I would choose like Talia's Desdemona paragraph. So in our essays, we mainly were exploring the idea of sexual agency in each piece of work. In Othello, there are both assertive and passive women, while in the horror movie It Follows, the main character is both chaste and sexually awakened at the same time. Ultimately, we found that in both works, the same message holds true. Men hold the power that control the fate of women.
In Shakespeare's Othello, Emilia plays an assertive feminist role as she's the only female character who recognizes that men have consummate power over women. In the beginning of the novel, Emilia is a passive figure. However, as the story progresses, she begins to speak up when she witnesses misogyny. One example is when Emilia comments about men to Desdemona after Othello gets angry that the handkerchief is missing. She states, "'Tis not a year or two shows us a man, and we all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us." So, Emilia here is aware that men solely use women to satisfy their needs, just like how food satisfies a hungry stomach. Desdemona does not reply to Emilia, indicating that she is not capable of having agency in her life, and rather she succumbs to being Othello's handkerchief. Othello owns her life. Emilia's intelligent words prove her to be a hero who challenges the status quo of women being passive figures. She's not afraid to speak the truth publicly that men use women carelessly. As a result, near the end of the play, Emilia steps outside of gender roles and yells at Othello and her husband. Although she was aware that she might be punished for speaking up, she still asserts herself, which results in her death.
In contrast, Othello uses the character Desdemona to demonstrate the societal fragmented view of women as her dismissive behavior allows her husband to have power over her. There are three main examples of this throughout the play. The first is the structure of the play itself. The way that the characters' lines are spread out throughout the novel, the male characters tend to have more lines than their female counterparts, so this reinforces the idea that men have authority over women. And in this case specifically, Othello's lines exceed his wife Desdemona's, showing his authority and her passive nature. Another example is that Desdemona is constantly kneeling before her husband, which is often seen as a sign of obedience and prayer. So it presents Othello as a godlike figure. And the last example is in her final scene, when she's killed by Othello, Emilia asks who murders her, like right before she dies, and she responds, "Nobody, I myself, farewell, commend me to my kind lord, oh farewell." So although she knows the truth that her husband was the one who just murdered her, she blames herself, and she refers to herself as nobody, demonstrating that she thinks nothing of herself, which we see throughout the novel. And she uses her last dying word to wish her husband well, the one who just killed her. So it just reinforces the idea that, like, she knows that he's the one who just killed her, yet her last dying word is to wish him well. So her dying wish as a whole demonstrates her submission to her husband and her eternal obedience to him. Her weakened sense of self and increased sense of passivity throughout the play shows that Othello has always had power over her from the moment they fell in love and wed to the moment that he murdered her.
So It Follows, I'm not sure if many of you have seen it, but it's a horror movie, and it's basically about a sexually transmitted disease that takes shape as a ghost, whether it be like takes shape as people you know, like your grandma or your friend or something, and then it tries to kill whoever inhabits this disease. So in the movie, the main character, her name is Jamie, she conflates all three tropes of femininity into one person because she is both sexually awakened and innocent at the same time. So these are just screen grabs from the movie. So in the first picture, we see Jamie swimming in her backyard pool. This pool represents her literal and physiological purity, as she has not yet had sex and she has not been corrupted by the ghost. As demonstrated at the end of the movie, we don't see this here, but at the end of the movie, her pool is now destroyed and drained of its water, much like her purity. In the second picture is Jamie in a car with a boy. And in the film It Follows, Jamie becomes confronted with a sexual desire which she expects to be a harmless rite of passage, but ultimately discovers that sex continues to be a burden that endlessly follows her. And in the third picture, we see her, she now understands what this sexually transmitted disease, like what comes with it. So as the movie progresses, Jamie's purity becomes impaired due to her sexual desires. So now she has the sexually transmitted disease that's going to follow her for the rest of the movie. And in the fourth picture, which is her grandma, additionally, her mental state has been damaged because of the ghost that follows her, essentially another way of punishing her for having sex. Jamie's constant fear leads her to try to seek a way to escape from the ghost's terrors. For example, for most of the movie, she isolates herself in small spaces like bedrooms, hospital rooms, and sheds. And in the fifth picture, we see what the ghost has made Jamie think of herself. So she becomes afraid of to be in her own skin, and often looking over at herself, judging her for her own body and what it has brought upon her. Similar to the developing self-conscious, society also forces women to become self-conscious about their sexual desires. This places control into the hands of society, and specifically men, taking away a woman's authority and agency. Much like Jamie's ghost, society punishes women for having strong sexual desires, which ultimately controls the fate of these women.
In our class, we recently talked about the different roles that men and women play in our society in the past and today. And one of the main ideas that came up in almost every discussion was the idea that women are expected to act passively and innocently towards men. They're expected to be submissive. And this innocent nature, in conjunction with men believing that they have an innate authority over women, allows men to punish women, as seen in both Othello and It Follows. So ultimately, in both of these pieces, whether women exhibit passive behavior, like Desdemona and Jamie, or they actively present themselves like Emilia, they end up with the same fate and the same undying, weak, and powerless relation to men. And you can see in the closing images of each work that these women are ultimately unable to regain control of their fate. Othello's last image is of a marriage bed filled with dead women, representing not only Desdemona's submission to her husband, but also the idea that in society, marriage will ultimately lead to punishment and death. And the last image of It Follows is of Jamie and her boyfriend walking together, showing their forced relationship, which, as we've explained, must conform to gender and power stereotypes in the movie. And it also demonstrates their unknown fate together.
Thank you.
Next up is Brandon Scott talking about gender roles in the Oresteia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brandon Scott. I'm a senior at Loyola High School, and I'm going to be talking about gender roles in the Oresteia. So the Oresteia, for those of you who don't know, is a Greek tragedy that's filled with murder, revenge, a quest for justice, and interference by the gods in human affairs. And all these elements make for a great tragedy. It is composed of 3 plays: Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, and Eumenides. And this is a lot of information here, but the main thing that you need to know is that in the first play, Agamemnon, a wife named Clytemnestra, kills her husband. And that takes us to the second play, which is Libation Bearers, where their son, Orestes, kills the mother in an act of revenge. And that takes us to the third play, Eumenides, where there is a trial in Athena's court to determine whether or not Orestes was guilty of committing the murder, whether or not the murder was justified or not. And this is my thesis. The main crux of my thesis is that this trilogy reinforces Greek society's gender stereotypes, which state that in order for society to progress, females must be oppressed. And that's the view of Greek society in this play. And there are 3 main Greek gender stereotypes that are explored in the trilogy. The first one is that women are viewed as deceitful, incapable of fulfilling a masculine role.
The second one is that women are gullible and emotionally driven, meaning that they lack the logic and reasoning that the male counterparts do. And the third gender stereotype is that women cannot commit treacherous acts such as murder. So these are 3 gender stereotypes of Greek society that are going to be explored throughout the trilogy. So in the first play, Agamemnon, there are a lot of examples of the wife, Clytemnestra, being portrayed as masculine. And this one piece of dialogue that I have here, I think, illustrates that. So the chorus, by the way, is a chorus of elderly men in society. And they say, "Or are you too respectful of appearances and dreams with their easy persuasion?" So immediately they are questioning the judgment of Clytemnestra and questioning whether or not she is knowledgeable of the actual truth or whether she's too emotionally driven. And rather than submitting to the male voice like the typical woman in Greek society at the time would be expected to do, she defends herself by saying, "I would not accept the fancies of a drowsing mind." So just by saying that, she's already differentiating herself from the typical woman in Greek society. And then the chorus continues to question her, saying, "Then has some unfledged rumor bolstered you?" So they continue to press on, continue to question her judgment, and Clytemnestra responds by still defending herself and defending her honor. She says, "You're quite faulting my intelligence like a young girl's." So the use of the word young girl here specifically shows a deeper meaning of what the gender stereotypes are in Greek society. It shows how embedded they are in the culture, and it shows that women themselves felt the need to differentiate themselves from the standard female archetype in order to gain value and to gain respect in society. So, yeah. And then this is another quote that Clytemnestra says immediately after killing her husband. She says, "You test me like a witless woman, but I speak with a fearless heart to those who know. And whether you yourself wish to prove or to blame me, it's all the same. This is Agamemnon, my husband, but a corpse. The work of my right hand here, a just architect, this is how things are." So not only was the act of killing her husband a typical masculine role in Greek society, her response to it also shows how she's different from the typical female, because rather than trying to hide from the blame or trying to act in a cowardly way to avoid being blamed for the murder, she openly accepts it to everybody. She proclaims it. She's proud of it. And she even goes further it's almost as if she's challenging anyone that's listening to question her authority and to question her power, which in Greek society puts her in a masculine place. So this line, I think, is the epitome of Clytemnestra seen as a masculine role in the play. And that brings us to the second play, Libation Bearers, where Clytemnestra is killed by her son, Orestes. And this sort of juxtaposition of the high point of Clytemnestra as a masculine role at the end of the first play, and then the immediate death of her in the second play, shows how any attempt for women in Greek society to gain power ends in their death and destruction. And the one quote I put here, Clytemnestra said immediately after, right before she was killed by her son, she says, "Stop, my son, hold back from respect for this breast. You often drowsed at it while your gums drew out its rich milk." So in this line, I thought it was especially important because she's attempting to appeal to her son's emotions using her feminine persona of the loving mother instead of the bold murderer of Agamemnon like we saw at the end of the first play. So this shows a final return to her feminine ways as the female surrendering her masculine identity in order to appease the larger order of Greek patriarchy. And that brings us to the third play, where there is a trial in Athena's court to determine whether or not Orestes' murder was justified. And this here is a quote by a scholar named Zeitlin that I think supports my argument. It says, "Clytemnestra, the female principal in the first play, is a shrewd, intelligent rebel against the masculine regime, but by the last play, through her representatives, the Erinyes, female is now allied with the archaic, primitive, and regressive, while male in the person of the young god Apollo champions conjugality, society, and progress, and his interests are ratified by the androgynous goddess Athena, who sides with the male and confirms his primacy." So the acquittal of Orestes in the trial, I think, represents a final restoration of masculine control and the condemnation of female power. Then we have the Furies transformation to Eumenides. And so the Furies in Greek society were these ancient goddesses who sought revenge for wrongful death. So after Clytemnestra was killed by her son, the Furies were pursuing Orestes in order to seek revenge on him. But after the acquittal in the trial, The Furies are converted to Eumenides, meaning that they still are goddesses that seek justice, but they are bound by the rulings of the court. So whatever Athena's court decides, they have to go by. So if Athena's court finds someone guilty, then they will pursue them and enact justice on them. But if the Athena's court finds that they are not guilty, then they will not enact any justice. So this is the quote here that shows the final transformation. The Furies say, "You will win me over, it seems. I am giving up my rancor." So this kind of submission to Athena and to the court system represents a final submission of the feminine identity to masculine power, since the courts are dominated by masculinity. And I think Athena shows this again when she states, "And let the light of fire set out on its way, so that this company for the land may in future be preeminent for its goodwill with the fortune of noble manhood." And Athena's declaration of prosperity for specifically the manhood of Athens conveys Greek society's view of progress, as it involves the well-being of only the men of Athens. And therefore, while framed as valuable contributors to society, the Eumenides have actually been stripped of their female independence in order to serve as advocates for masculine power. So in conclusion, this parallel between societal evolution and diminishing female value represents the entirety of Greek gender philosophy, solidifying sexist gender stereotypes and justifying masculine domination.
Next up is Eleanor Hammond, talking about John Updike and Carson McCullers.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Let's get started. Okay, so my work is called Rose-Colored Veil, Identity and Sexuality in Updike and McCullers. Okay, so the ins and outs. The works I analyzed are Too Far to Go by John Updike and The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. So Too Far to Go is set in New York City and in the wealthy coast of New England, so two different places. And it talks about the marriage between Joan and Richard Maple, a husband and wife, who maintain a superficially heteronormative marriage throughout which they both commit adultery. And this is set in the 60s and 70s. And then The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers, which is in the 40s, is about Frankie, a 12-year-old girl who has a sort of tomboy attitude and is obsessed with the idea of marriage. She's inspired by her brother and his fiance's relationship and tries to imitate it on a date with a soldier, which I will get into. But she's not just a tomboy. To try to display her fantasy of heteronormative marriage, she creates this persona for herself, F. Jasmine, her alter ego, a sophisticated, feminine, and seemingly more mature version of herself as a way to display marriage. So thematically, Richard, Joan, that couple, and Frankie wrestle with societal boundaries caused by flaws in their relationships and how they treat sexual tension. So you've heard this word heteronormativity maybe before, and I'm going to mention it a lot, have already. Basically, my definition of it is a word describing behaviors consistent with traditional, reductive, or confining gender roles, specifically centered around the way men and women are expected to relate to each other. So we have Frankie Adams. Again, she's a 12-year-old boyish girl who is awakening sexually and emotionally, again, struggling with her identity and trying to become more feminine to display her idea of a fantasy of a heteronormative marriage. So basically, this is how she does this. So she meets this soldier on the street, and they're in the World War II times, the 40s, and so she just randomly meets a soldier, and on her date with the soldier, she and him attempt to perform her idea of heteronormativity, but struggle because of the large age gap between them. She strives to have this relationship, this other couple, kind of a model relationship, Richard and Joan in Updike, although she only sees the uncorrupted version of that relationship because of her young age and inexperience. If you read this quote, you see her lack of words signifies her naivety and the couple's incompatible objectives, her and the soldier. His rambling walk indicates his adventurous libido, a reckless desire which she cannot comprehend. Physically, she can't keep up with him, which makes me think that she has emotional difficulty to understand him. The soldier views Frankie as a means for sex, whilst Frankie views him as a possible entrance into her sexless emulation of heteronormativity. So this date continues. she actually has 2 dates. This is like the first time they meet. And then the second time, at the beginning of their date, she sits across the soldier at the booth in the Blue Moon. This is the bar. And she suddenly sees the 3 of them. So in the middle of this, so she's at this date. And in the middle of it, she has this fantasy of herself, her brother, and the bride. So remember that she's really inspired by her brother's relationship with his fiancé. And they're walking beneath a cold Alaskan sky, a rope tying the 3 of them together. And then in the actual present, it seems to F. Jasmine that this date is a bit unreal to her, which is interesting because she feels this fantasy is more real to her and more relatable than the date she's having at the moment. This is the fantasy of participating in a marriage, having all the benefits without having to be the husband or the wife and sexually involved in the marriage. And also this is significant because this is the first time she goes out as this persona, F. Jasmine. She dresses up in heels, she wears makeup, she tries to look older. And Frankie realizes in this moment that heteronormativity is attractive to her because she believes it will allow her to see the world and gain mobility, but you'll see that she actually becomes immobile. A bit later, Frankie goes to the soldier's hotel room. She feels this, quote, the silence in the hotel room, and there is a mysterious uneasiness that lasts until she realizes what is wrong. The soldier does not take his strange eyes from her, and she's scared. The moment when she realizes what is wrong is the breaking of her innocent view of marriage. The nature of her and the soldier's relationship falls outside of her fantasy, and she sees the soldier's pursuit is not just a game anymore, because it is not just sexless. Therefore, in this moment, she is othered, because she cannot understand real marriage or sex, she cannot be a part of her brother's wedding, and she cannot be sexual with the soldier. These are both things that are further beyond her comprehension, but are both things she tried to conform to with this identity, F. Jasmine. And then we have the Maples, this other relationship, which I think is a good model that Frankie tries to strive for with a heteronormative marriage, but you realize that it's not really as perfect as it seems. So Updike's Richard and Joan Maple make marriage seem flawless on the outside, but their marriage has a lot of problems on the inside. Rebecca, a single friend of the married couple, comes over for dinner. As Rebecca, their friend, watches Joan, the wife, and Richard, the husband, at the table, Joan puts her arms around Richard, and Rebecca retains without modification her sweet, absent look and studies through the embracing couple the scene outdoors. When Rebecca starts to leave, Joan begs her not to because Rebecca's presence has become, in her mind, inextricable elements of one enchanting moment. So what I got from this incident is that Richard and Joan do not feel the need to be romantic in their relationship unless there's an audience, Rebecca, who they're performing for. Therefore, they have a superficial relationship in which they're also performing their fantasy of perfect heteronormativity. And I think Frankie is similar to their friend Rebecca in the sense that she wants to place herself between 2 married people, as Frankie wants to place herself between her brother and his wife to get this sense of marriage without actually being part of a marriage. So comparing these 2 couples, the power of desire. As both couples continue to try to perform perfect ideas of marriage, Richard and Joan and Frankie see the flaws of their heteronormative performances when they realize their true sexual desires that break their perfect performances. These sexual desires cause unfaithful actions in Richard and Joan's marriage, which create more distance between Richard and Joan in their relationship. And this is similar to the sexual desires of the soldier towards Frankie. Age and differing sexual intentions create more distance between them as well. So here are some examples of these desires that Joan and Richard have in their relationship. Joan discovers other sexual desires but represses them when she belittles the significance of her kiss with a friend at a gathering, Mac. So Richard discovers them kissing, and Joan completely covers it up because she says she has no lover. Stop trying to make her more interesting than she is. All she is a beat-up housewife who wants to go play tennis with other tired ladies. After the dinner I previously mentioned, Richard walks Rebecca to her apartment afterwards. Remember, Rebecca is their friend that's just visiting. All is fine until, quote, at the door, her conduct was hard to explain. Rebecca stood unnecessarily close, but by shifting the weight of her body to one leg and leaning her head sideways, she lowered her height, placing him in a dominant position. As she went down the stairs, she rested both hands on the banister and looked down towards the landing. Good night, she said. He looked up. Oh, but they were so close. Richard craves this tangible drama involved in his wife's infidelity. This sexual tension and drama can make the idea of relationships more interesting, and this power of desire, this forbidden idea of adultery, is seen in both Richard and Joan. This desire that again ruins the purity of their heteronormative performance. This is what Frankie inherits as she realizes her idea of a sexless relationship doesn't exist. She cannot comprehend that performance and sex. She cannot comprehend that sex and performance go together in a marriage. So, Richard and Joan's marriage does not exist without another variable, whether that be adultery, another person like Rebecca, and Frankie cannot successfully display heteronormativity until she stops striving for her display to be perfect, or what her idea of perfection is, which is sexless. Whether it be adultery, another person involved, or other sexual desires, something is always lurking behind the scenes. Marriage cannot successfully succeed until the idea of perfection is gone. When one is young and naive, the idea of marriage can be viewed through rose-colored glass. As one grows older, they experience their sexuality, new desires, changes, and new people. Slowly, this rose-colored glass shatters. Thank you.
And now we have Kayla Cohen, who will take us from Adam to Rochester.
Thank you. Hi. Do I need the mic, or can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay. Hi. My name is Kayla Cohen. I'm a senior at Milken. Before I start, I just wanted to thank you guys so much for letting us come and speak. I've never done anything like this. I think this is a really cool platform to share ideas, and I'm going to be talking about women in a minute, and I don't think there's a more appropriate place, maybe neither a more intimidating place to be talking about women than at Archer. Okay, so my essay, I wrote an essay analyzing the power imbalances that exist between this woman, Jane Eyre, and her master, Mr. Rochester, in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And I also drew parallels and between Jane Eyre and the story of creation, like other people. I go to a Jewish day school, so we've obviously analyzed the story of creation a lot. And I think Adam was originally created without a counterpart. All other animals were created with a man and a woman. And I think most people kind of look at the story of creation as women being subservient to men, which is true. Woman is eventually created from Adam's rib. But I think it's important to remember that woman was only created because man was vulnerable. Adam was the one who was lonely. Adam was the one who was lacking a counterpart. Adam was the one who actually needed a friend. So God created woman from man's rib, and woman was subservient. She was created to kind of absolve man of his own loneliness and to serve him. And I think the same thing can be said of Jane. Jane Eyre follows this girl Jane. She's an orphan. She's growing up in England. And the book kind of follows her transformation from being a servant and being kind of at everyone else's disposal to finally reaching her own independence. And what really kind of disturbed me about the book was that Jane Eyre is considered to be like a feminist novel in the canon, but Jane ends up marrying her master. And I thought that was kind of weird. How could you ever consider a woman to be independent if she's commits herself to life to a man who emotionally manipulated her? There's a lot of parallels in language between the creation story and also Jane Eyre's language. Her master, Mr. Rochester, refers to her and loving her as in his likeness. He refers to Jane as his flesh. He refers to her loving her as his own. And I think that, and what was really eerie to me was this one specific quote. I don't know if everyone can read it in the back, but it says, Mr. Rochester when Mr. Rochester her master actually proposes to Jane, he describes his love as if it was a string connecting his rib to something inside of Jane's rib. And it was eerie to me because in school there was, in 10th grade, there was this commentary saying that Eve was also fashioned from Adam's rib. So it was a very weird parallel, thinking that woman actually derived her sense of self from the physicality of man. I also wanted to say that we also read the translation of Elliot Friedman's translation of the Bible, and he actually described Eve's creation, and he described Eve as kezer negdo, or like as a counterpart. And Friedman expanded upon it, saying that Eve was kind of like a counter strength to Adam, and that kind of got me thinking. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. I'm so sorry. Yes, please. Sorry. I don't know what I did. Yes, thank you. It kind of got me asking, like, what does it actually mean to be a counterpart, in Friedman's words? What does it mean for women who... Is it possible for women to be independent within relationships? Is it possible for them to kind of exert their own independence within their interdependence with other people? Is it possible for... And I also want to know, what is it that women exactly are countering if they're considered to be counterparts? Okay, I don't want to mess this up. I just clicked this. Okay. Okay. So to get into the novel, this is just like kind of a brief summary. As I mentioned before, Jane is an orphan and she's very vulnerable. She ends up she spends her first years with her family, the Reeds, and every time, and I think her childhood kind of conditions her to be submissive. Every time Jane's seen reading a book, or if she's seen chastising someone, if she brings up something that's not considered appropriate for a little girl to do, she's taken immediately to the Red Room and she's isolated there. Her family decides that she doesn't fit the mold and she's not submissive enough, so they send her to the Lowood School for Girls after, wow, that just got really loud, after a few years. And as Britt said, I think she used a similar image. Mr. Brocklehurst, the headmaster at the school, only further, he tries to reinforce and to make her to continue that submissiveness. He starves the girls, he deprives them of their own voice, he kind of wants to keep them in a lowly place, and I think this is a scene of him actually humiliating, I don't know if it's Jane or one of the girls, Jane, for taking a piece of food. So definitely the idea that you must submit to authority is ingrained in her at a young age. And both of these two places, in the Red Room and at the Lowood School, Jane is completely isolated, and that kind of sets her up to be passive and to be submissive when it comes time to actually going to Thornfield Hall, where she works for her master, Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester is emotionally abusive and emotionally manipulative. He's much older than Jane. He's about 20 years older than her. So along with having many more years on her, he's also physically powerful, and he also suppresses Jane's voice. He kind of toys with her emotions, and he invites other women over, and he kind of has mock marriages, even though he knows that Jane kind of ends up liking him. And he definitely makes... And whenever Jane wants to leave, he always keeps her tied back. He kind of plays with money to make sure that she does return. Okay, so knowing that Jane's kind of on this trajectory to be passive to authority and to submit, Mr. Rochester ends up proposing to her, and she accepts initially until she learns about Bertha. And this is like the craziest point in the novel. My copy is like 500 pages, and like in the middle of this, and all of this is working up to this one scene where we learn of Mr. Rochester's like estranged wife locked in the attic. Like, it came out of nowhere. So this is Bertha. She's considered Jane's evil twin. Jane is white. She is passive. She is very quiet. She is plain. And she's proper. Bertha, on the other hand, is from the Caribbean. She was married. Mr. Rochester married her, and he worked out some kind of a deal, and he ended up bringing her back to London. She is definitely isn't afraid to express herself sexually. She is wild. She is messy. She's everything that Jane isn't. And I think a lot of people and we did this in English class, a lot of people like to contrast Jane and Bertha, mainly because their characters and their personalities are so different. But I think you can kind of also draw parallels between Bertha and Jane. Bertha is locked in an attic and she kind of goes psycho after she marries Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester kind of just forgets about her and he moves on with Jane. And Bertha is definitely isolated, and she represents the symbolic pent-up aggression when a higher power that a higher power can exert over a lower person. And I think as we saw with Jane, as she worked through the Red Room to the Lowood, her past wasn't that much different. And had she also married Mr. Rochester, she would have found herself in the same place as in an isolated space, and also subordinated. When Jane learns of Bertha, she rejects Mr. Rochester's marriage proposal and she leaves Thornfield Hall. It's the first time in the book where she's out in the open space. Literally, she's not confined to the Lowood School, to Thornfield Hall, and she's not in the same place that we found Bertha in when she was in the attic. And when Jane's away, she gains power. She finds family for the first time. She reconnects. She also finds her own family fortune after she meets her family. So while Jane is away and she grows and she comes into her power, Mr. Rochester remains at Thornfield Hall. And what happens is Bertha ends up setting the manor on fire. And I think obviously that's a symbol for that kind of degradation of that power imbalance that existed. And at the same time, Mr. Rochester loses his physical power. He loses his eyesight. He actually becomes blind. He loses one of his limbs. He loses his manor. He loses his physical, his wealth. And while the manor is burning down, he actually tries to go in and to save some of the servants, including Bertha, who he had neglected the entire time. So I think it's interesting to note that as Jane rises in power and as the two are independent of one another, Jane rises in power and Mr. Rochester's power contracts. And these two, I think Jane's rise in power kind of counters Mr. Rochester's loss of power. Mr. Rochester also becomes more vulnerable, more naive, and he gains a greater appreciation for other people. I think while they're separate, they grow into their own selves as individuals, becoming both more naive and more vulnerable, but also more kind of cognizant of where they stand in relation to other people. Jane ends up returning to Thornfield Hall by her own will, and I think Charlotte Bronte could have stopped the novel after Jane had left Thornfield Hall, and I feel like that kind of would have been like I think that would have been like the normal feminist ending, I guess, because who needs a man and all of that stuff. But I think it's really interesting that Charlotte Bronte actually ends the novel having Jane actually return to Thornfield and marry her master in his most vulnerable state in the entire novel. This is the first time the reader actually, when Jane addresses the reader in a new chapter, she begins with this quote, "Reader, I married him." And I think it's important to note that her use of active voice definitely demonstrates not only her newfound power, but the newfound power that exists within the relationship. Jane and Rochester not just find their own power, a balance of power and vulnerability, not just within themselves, but within their union. And also, I think it's also important to note that Jane and Mr. Rochester have a child together. And Mr. Rochester gains part of his eyesight back right after the child is born to represent the greater clarity that comes when you retract from your power and you kind of get that greater sense of vulnerability. So why did Charlotte Bronte end the book with Jane marrying her once emotionally abusive and manipulative master? Why is this considered a feminist novel? I might upset some of you guys. Forgive me, this is a refashioning of the story of Genesis and what it means to be a counterpart. But basically, independence does not mean isolation. I think it's possible for us to be independent and interdependent. I think that I think we like to divide ourselves and subdivide ourselves into groups. And before we consider ourselves men or women, gay or straight, and focus on ourselves as individuals, it's important to remind ourselves that we're humans, but before everything else. And we're emotionally independent. We're emotionally dependent. Take Adam. I think, and as I said this before, we saw Adam was, before Eve was created, Adam was so vulnerable that he actually needed somebody else. And woman offered that source of power to man. It wasn't, I think, as I said this before, we kind of think that the creation story is a power imbalance that really only portrays the woman as the weaker counterpart. But man was the one who was generally vulnerable. And I think that speaks to our general humanity and how we all are interdependent and emotionally rely on one another. I think, and I want to leave you guys with that point, that I think it can be just as, I think we can find, when we start to isolate ourselves, especially women, we forget that there's a whole other group of people, not just romantic partners, but in platonic relationships. There's a bunch of other people that can counter our weaknesses and can actually help us grow into ourselves within those relationships. We can become independent people through relationships and through our dependencies on others. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have time for a couple of quick questions.
I noticed that with almost all of your presentations, there was kind of an interesting dichotomy that came where female sexuality was both a form of empowerment, but also one that was used to oppress them. And I was wondering if you guys could and girls could speak to that a little bit more, please.
Is that working?
Okay. Dichotomy. I think women are typically more vulnerable to this clash of being both like open with their sexuality, but also having to be careful. And I think that's just due to like societal pressures and everything like that. But I think this ties back to my essay. I think women also face, and men, but women face two pressures. There's a dichotomy of having to balance your internal sense of independence with your with other relationships. Personally, I think had I gone to an all-girls school, I would have felt that separation stronger, and I kind of feel like I would have felt the need to express to separate those two parts. But I definitely feel like that the dichotomy is a personal thing. I think it affects more girls or more guys more so than others. I don't think there's definitely a gradient.
Another question? Anyone else?
Similar about the dichotomy of female sexuality. I was just wondering about how you guys think your arguments relate to the intersectionality of feminism and how these different facets of female identity and sexuality are played out in feminism today.
Well, I think maybe in my essay I explored not only like heteronormative relationships, but how someone who could be non-gender conforming or just someone that is more boyish or doesn't really have like a certain gender kind of relates to heteronormative relationships. So I think that's already kind of an intersection of gender as well as sexual relationships. Yeah, it's really interesting how you relate intersectionality to feminism. I think a lot of times, like, it's just personally to me, I want to explore how gender relates to race, how gender relates to religion, and things like that, because I feel like I can get like better arguments because of that, and I can get more complicated arguments. So I think that's really cool, and I think that's a great question. I really want to explore that more, like how race relates, how religion relates. I think that's how class relates. Yeah, I think that's really, really cool. Great question.
I think if you take the term sexuality and maybe morph it a little bit more into repression and the idea that women repress their true emotions, I think a prevalent topic today would be, let's take a movement like Free the Nipple that goes so completely against repression. It takes a form of sexuality that you typically would conceal within yourself and completely goes the opposite direction, just out there. And I think that it doesn't just have to be sexuality. I think many aspects of female personalities can get encased due to cultural differences. I think that you can definitely find cultures where it's not so rigid, like what Kayla mentioned with Jane being brought up in England. Definitely raised her to be repressed and polite and all of those typical things. And that's definitely an issue that we need to combat today. We should explore other cultures and the way that women are able to express themselves more openly.
Thank you all. Sorry, we're rushed for time. We'll take a short break and get into panel 3.